Thanks, Rosie. Looks like the numbers are all clicking over there. So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name's Bruce McFarlane. I'm the CEO of Blue Rock Group. And for those of you who haven't been part of the Blue Rock community before or haven't been one of our webinars before, Blue Rock is a entrepreneurial advisory firm. We've got two parts of our business. We've got a professional services part with accounting, law, finance, a placemaking business, and amongst others. And then we have an investment part of our business where we co-own and co-operate and co-locate when we're allowed back in our office with a number of businesses, including hospitality, retail, and technology businesses as well. And so the effects of COVID have impacted on everyone, obviously, and they've impacted on us both as business owners and also as advisors to a number of different businesses. We've got about 3,500 clients, and there's a number of businesses that are tenants or landlords. So today's session, we're going to really dive down into the implications of the National Leasing Code and the updates that have come out recently, and the impacts for landlords and tenants and their and how they negotiate their rent under these new rules. So thank you for everyone for joining us. Some of the logistics just before I introduce our panel today. So if you do want to ask a question, and we really encourage that, we've got the Q&A function there, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to actually ask a question. But the Q&A function, we will take questions on the way through as we go through the different topics. So please feel free to ask a question. We're recording the session, so we'll send an email round tomorrow with a copy of the recording if you happen to drop out or you want to share the recording, and we'll have some links to additional information. So thank you. But today we're joined with a fantastic panel. So we've got Lauren Smythe. So Lauren is an associate director in our legal team. So welcome, Lauren. We've got Frank Deruta, who's a director in our accounting team. So welcome, Frank. We've got Cal Cameron, and so Cal, Blue Rock places on his name tag there, but he's also a director of Propeller, which is a technology business that he can talk a little bit more about later. And then Keith Doyle. So Keith's joining us today. Keith is the COO of BDC Property Partners. So welcome, Keith. Thanks, everyone. So we'll kick straight off. So Lauren, the amendments to the COVID-19 Omnibus Lease and Licenses Regulations came into effect on the 29th of September. So what are some of the key changes?
Thanks, Bruce. So I think most importantly, they extend the operation of the regulations from its previous sunset date of the 29th of September to the end of the year now, to 31 December 2020. So effectively, that means that the moratorium on termination has been extended to that date. So if tenants don't pay rent or outgoings, or they fail to trade during that period, a landlord can't terminate the lease. They've also created a new process for making a request for rent relief. So in effect, there's a new regime for rent relief for this next 3-month period, which started on the 30th of September. The definition of eligible lease has changed. So tenants that are no longer required to be employers, meaning that sole traders are now eligible. The regulations also now clarify that the definition of turnover for the purpose of calculating the tenant's decline in turnover must exclude any JobKeeper payments. They haven't sort of gone so far as to deal with the treatment of other grants or government payments, just clarified that JobKeeper is to be excluded. The payment of deferred rent, that now must be pushed back to the 1st of January, and this includes any agreements that were made prior to the changes. So if parties have reached an agreement which required payment of deferred rent before the 1st of January, that date now will automatically be pushed back to a date that's no sooner than the 1st of January next year. And also critically, there's now a prescribed method for calculating rent relief, and it must be proportionate to the tenant's reduction in turnover associated with the premises. And at least 50% of that rent relief must be in the form of a waiver, and 50% is a deferral. So essentially, they're the key changes.
Okay, thank you. And we'll dive into some of them in a little bit more detail. But I guess commercially, we'll start with you, Keith. What do you think the impact on the changes will be on the market?
Yeah, good question, Bruce. I think the real impacts probably will really won't be seen in the market until probably post Christmas and potentially when JobKeeper ends. But if we look at the impacts from a short term to a longer term, and we look at the impacts from a retailer side and potentially a landlord side, I think if we take one step back and say, well, the interpretation of the legislation initially was always a problem. There was a lot of ambiguity around the interpretation, and the landlords would look at it from one side, and obviously the retailer would look at it from the other. So for me, in terms of giving us clarity gives us confidence, and a retailer understanding what the next steps are and what that roadmap looks like certainly gives you confidence. Now, I think out of a couple of the points that Lauren just mentioned, from a BDC perspective and from our clients, I suppose what we like particularly is probably the relief to a gross rent versus a base rent. Now, albeit that retrospectively cannot be backdated, I think that's a positive, because you're talking about retailers that have had blunt trauma over the last number of months, and trying to navigate what the next steps look like, particularly in Victoria, where we still don't really have a definitive timeline as to when we're going to be able to open back up. I think that creates a bit of confidence, and so that's going to be a direct impact. I think probably again another major one would be that they've extended that period as to when they're covered under an eligible lease. So obviously being held in breach for maybe trading at different trading hours because you're watching your payroll, or potentially not having your bank guarantee drawn down. These are the things that I think will give a retailer confidence to be able to say, okay, everybody's working with me here, and I'm going to work with them, and hopefully we can find a solution. So I think they're probably two of the bigger ones. But I think overall the impact will be just creating that momentum to continue negotiations in good faith, that we can find a resolution. And ultimately, that's what everyone has tried to do. It's been more difficult in some cases because I think some landlords have had a different position. Some retailers have had a different position. So I think that's important to say, well, overall, there's some good impacts here, but, it's probably fair to say that the retailer has a bit of a better go at this one with these amended regulations. One thing that Lauren mentioned as well that I would probably be a little bit weary of as an impact would certainly be that more independent retailer that's probably a mom and dad type operation. And I think you've got a situation whereby, again, they've gone through something that they've never experienced in their business career before, and not understanding maybe where they can turn to for relief and to get some good advice. With the extended amendment around maybe re-qualifying what you needed to qualify for, which was JobKeeper, providing your proof of turnover was below 30% or above 30%, and all of those things and those boxes that you had to tick, you're going to have to potentially go back to the landlord now from that 31st to the end of December to make sure that they're aware of that, and that they've got all that relevant information to make sure that you apply and you actually get that relief during that period. So I've got a little bit of a concern around the impact of that, because I just don't believe it's, I think it's probably going to be a lack of ignorance. And I say that very respectfully, because some of these guys just don't know what's available. And then I suppose lastly, the impact, we cannot forget the landlord in all of this. And there's a massive impact on the landlord. And not every landlord in this conversation is one of the big REITs, and they're not all a big Westfield, and they can be a private investor. So I think, for them, obviously not being able to evict the tenant, for them not being able to maybe have someone in breach, or, because there are retailers, Bruce, that have potentially done the wrong thing during this time. They haven't exactly been, I suppose, sharing the proportionate blame, and they've been withholding rent. Now, we've always said from day one that that's not a strategy that we would back in, and it's really important that it's not the landlord's fault this pandemic has happened. So you've got to work basically with both parties. So I suppose there will be a small impact to the landlord going forward on some of these regs, and you're going to have a situation where I suppose the time frame is being delayed now till the end of December, and then potentially that ticking bomb, and that's kind of, some people say, there's some been great expressions lately, but the lead in the saddle regarding the deferral conversation. I think that will play out probably now from the 1st of January potentially, and that's certainly going to have a big impact on our industry.
Yeah, and Cal, what are you seeing in the market at the moment with obviously the landlords? It's a big impact on the landlords not being able to enforce their leases for a while, and so how are you finding it?
Yeah, look, I think the short answer for me about, I guess, the impact on the market is that, it's really positive that the amendments are providing further clarity on some matters that were previously really unclear. But I guess the short answer is this extension to the regulations is probably just delaying more of those eventual outcomes and longer term discussions that, tenants and landlords are still yet to really have in a lot of cases. And again, that's not being critical because there's a whole lot of reasons why it's been really difficult. There's been a general inability or perhaps unwillingness to basically conform with the regulations for a range of different reasons, and they can be things like the actual outcome of the regulations for the landlord or the tenant could be unpalatable, for example. So maybe avoiding the discussion. Landlords and tenants, basically both being severely impacted in terms of their livelihood and the prospect of being forced to fight that extra battle again, to go in again, and is kind of being put into that too hard basket, and it's wearing thin. So that I guess delay in extending it through to the end of December is again just keeping you in that too hard basket. I concur with Keith's comments about I think still that lack of general understanding around what the regulations actually mean, and then how to actually action them. Given it's essentially just a framework for the parties to do a deal, but it's really complex and there's individual commercial relationships. And so the regulations are sort of going, here's some things you must and must not do, but the rest you just kind of got to go and sort out yourselves. But I think really the biggest hurdle is that ongoing uncertainty surrounding what's going to happen in the future, particularly given our continuing lockdown here in Melbourne. Meaning that landlords and tenants are both really struggling to be able to commit to something longer term. In normal circumstances, they'd be able to do that, which I think is fair enough because, that my big question is what happens in 1 January, and, we'll talk about that later, but, that's really the key. So I think the amendments and the regulations are really just still just trying to keep things ticking along and essentially just deferring the eventual outcomes from this.
Yeah, there could be a bit of trouble. Before I get to you, Frank, and talk about some of the eligibility stuff, Lauren, there's a question in the chat around leases that are overholding. So I think the lease needed to be in place on the 29th of March. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And that hasn't changed under the amended regulations. So there's different criteria for eligibility, which I know Frank's going to touch on, but essentially one of those components is if you don't have a lease in place by the 29th of March, or even if you subsequently renewed your lease after that point in time, you're still caught, but essentially there needs to be a lease or you don't get the benefit of the regulations or the provisions in the regulations.
Thanks. So Frank, the eligibility requirements under the regulations, how does the turnover test under JobKeeper, how does it all work?
Yeah, so I guess they kind of interrelate to each other, and there's, you've got to pass a number of things to get it across the line. So as Lauren said, you got to have an eligible lease. You have to be an SME entity with a turnover less than 50 mil, and you have to be entitled to JobKeeper and be able to make JobKeeper payments is like the criteria. And then obviously there's the turnover test, which it's slightly changed with what's included in turnover. So as it's a lot more clearer now with, that JobKeeper payments received aren't included in that turnover test. So it's usual 30% decrease in turnover to pass the turnover test, and it obviously 15% for not-for-profits. One thing to keep in mind is that if you use the cash or accrual method, and some people might know what the difference is, but it's basically how you report your income, whether you report on when you receive the cash or when you actually invoice for the sales. So if you've used that method previously, you have to use that method again. And that's the same with JobKeeper too. If you used cash to get JobKeeper, then you have to use cash to compare your turnover from this year to last year when you're using a comparable period. A thing also to keep in mind with the turnover test, there are the alternative tests. So you've got to ensure that if it's a new business, there's a different test. If you've grown significantly during the last 12 months, there's a significant increase in turnover test, which a lot of my clients that didn't pass the September turnover of September quarter versus last September quarter over test actually passed through the growth turnover test and was still eligible for JobKeeper. So ensure that you are looking at those alternative tests, especially if you just miss out, because there are other alternatives to get you across the line, which obviously it's great to get JobKeeper, but then it also allows you to be in the position to negotiate the lease as well. So it has a twofold effect. So it's really important you do as much digging into whether you're eligible for JobKeeper 2.0 in that regard. Another thing also is if your business, say you've got a hospitality venue and you're starting to do online sales now, but you're not actually using the venue. So just say you make your own, like hot sauce, but you're not doing it on site and you're selling that hot sauce online. Those internet sales potentially don't get included in your GST turnover when you're comparing the comparison for the rent calculations. So the rules are a bit more clearer this time, and it's more about the premise revenue. So yeah, there are opportunities here to kind of get it more of a rent reduction without with continuing online sales.
There's a couple of questions in the chat. I'll go to, and whether it's Lauren or Frank, but the one around if your turnover has decreased by 80%, is it possible to ask for an 80% reduction in your rent?
Yeah. That's sort of one of the key changes. I think initially when the code came out, one of the guiding principles in the code was that rent should be reduced proportionate to a tenant's turnover. In Victoria, that sort of principle wasn't codified. It was sort of alluded to, but most parties sort of had respect for that principle and generally reduced rent accordingly, although some didn't. Now the amendments have clarified that rent must be reduced proportionate to a tenant's turnover associated with the premises, but no other premises, as Frank mentioned.
But in that scenario, half will be deferred and half will be discounted.
Yep.
Yeah, I have actually spoke to the landlord last week, and they said and again, I should probably clarify that a lot of my clients are large institutional landlords that manage office buildings in the CBD and in a city. So, this particular landlord had actually said in a lot of cases with F&B operators where their turnover is zero, they've actually waived the whole rent and just said, we're not actually deferring 50%. We're going outside the code because, again, what's going to happen in 1 January when the city opens back up, if it does, fingers crossed. We're looking at Sydney. Sydney hasn't been in lockdown, and yet those office buildings are only 20% occupied. So there are landlords out there who are thinking beyond just the immediate code to go, how do we partner with the tenants to make sure that they are going to be viable when they open back up? But again, on the flip side, there's other landlords who aren't too.
Yeah. I'll get back to some of the other questions in the chat in a sec. But Lauren, what do the tenants need to do now if they want rent relief?
So if a tenant needs rent relief for this new period, so from 30 September to 31 December, they need to make a new request to the landlord. The advice from the Victorian Small Business Commissioner is that a tenant will only be entitled to rent relief for the extended period from the date that the tenant makes that written application to the landlord. I think that's certainly the way the changes to the regulations are being interpreted. I'm not entirely certain that was what was intended with the drafting. We didn't see any draft regulations, and then they weren't published until the 30th of September. And then suddenly there was seemingly an obligation for tenants to suddenly scramble together all this information, provide statements to be entitled to rent relief, and then the clock started sort of ticking. So I think practically for tenants that might already have agreements in place up until the 30th of September, or those that for whatever reason only need rent relief for this next period, I think it's practical that those tenants, that the regulations are interpreted so that those tenants have to pull together that information, provide it to their landlords, and then get rent relief for that period. But I mean, otherwise, there's just so much fatigue out there around everything that's going on. And I just think there's no sense or benefit for either party, landlord or tenant, in treating sort of the pre 30 September and the post 30 September as separate periods, like with a gap in time. And I think it's sensible that parties just worked together and, you know, towards reaching a resolution that's, you know, as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So give the information to your landlord, but don't sweat the small stuff. Don't get bogged out in the detail in the regulations and try and work out, you know, interpret what it actually means. I think we just sort of need to look at the bigger picture and work towards, you know, finding a resolution that's going to work for both parties.
And I know when the leasing code first came in, there was a bit of uncertainty around the actual information, Frank, that you needed to provide. And, you know, did you need to provide, you know, all your P&Ls and your balance sheet and everything for the last 3 years, or what was the information? Is there more clarity now as to what the tenants have to provide the landlords?
Yeah, they have, I guess, simplified and narrowed it down a bit more. So you have to make a statement that the lease is eligible, confirmation that the lease is not excluded from the operations of the regs under the Act. And then from a more financial perspective, so you can provide either your BAS, bank statements or accounting records, or a statement from your accountant to show the details of the decline in turnover for the tenant. So generally what I've been experienced is majority of the clients that I do this for, I just prepare a letter showing this is, you know, the revenue September 19 and this is September 20 and this is the percentage of decline. And don't provide like bank statements and BASs and so forth, because they're a bit, I guess, tricky to understand. And if it's written from an accountant, then, you know, that should be seen as, I guess, gospel, and that, you know, that's the accurate information in a summary form. And then you just need to provide proof that you're entitled to JobKeeper again, and just, you know, provide the receipt number of the application that you get from the ATO. So the accountant can, and your advisor can provide a lot of this as well. So hopefully it shouldn't take too long to put this together, but by the sounds of it, like the sooner the better. Just get on the front foot, get it together, send it off to the landlord, and get the ball rolling with the transparency of the whole thing. You don't want to wait till November and say, no, well, the rules were, you know, set up from the 1st of October, and then you have to have that awkward conversation. So I definitely recommend getting on the front foot with all of this.
Thanks, Frank. I'll go to one of the questions, probably for you, Lauren, to start with. There was around structure. So there was a lot of, you know, if one entity in the group doesn't qualify JobKeeper, so Simon's asked a question about a service entity that doesn't qualify. Are there any changes or any tips around negotiating where you've got different structures in your group?
No, but I think what Simon's alluding to is like a leasehold entity, where what comes to mind for me is like a franchisor where they set up a leasehold entity, and then that leasehold entity holds the lease and then licenses it to a franchisee. So unfortunately, no, the amendments to the regulations haven't dealt with that. But I have dealt with a number of matters for franchisors and franchisees, just in terms of lease negotiations and mediation. And I think it's commonly accepted now that although you do have a tenant that sort of effectively sits in the middle between the landlord and the franchisee licensee, the franchisee, strictly speaking, under the definition of tenant, particularly in Victoria, is actually a tenant. And if they qualify and they're eligible, then the landlord should be providing that rent relief directly to the franchisee as the tenant and the party that's entitled to occupation of the premises. Not all landlords share that view. So it's a matter of negotiating, and it definitely depends on a case-by-case basis.
Have you found that too, Keith, that in franchising that landlords have tried to be a little bit cute around the regulations and saying that the actual tenant doesn't qualify, so bad luck?
Yeah, unfortunately, but I think it's sometimes there's weight in numbers, and depending on the size of that entity, sometimes the portfolio conversation can be quite large. And I think to Frank or Lauren's point, ideally everyone's looking for a resolution here. Now, if you're a tenant sitting and thinking you're eligible and you're not paying rent, and the landlord's thinking you're not eligible and he's not getting rent, well, all of a sudden you've got an issue. And look, I think, when negotiations started, we bring it right back. I mean, it was a very slow, painstaking process because of the ambiguity around all of this. And I think, we started off having conversations at the very beginning whereby certain landlords wanted non-disclosure agreements, and that wasn't part of what the framework said. So there was all these things that people were trying, and then ultimately it was coming down to this conversation and negotiations going nowhere. And we all need to try to find a resolution. So yes, to answer your question in short, yes, there has been, but even in some of those instances, it's moved on from there, just again to find resolution. I think it's very important to point out the fact that in some cases, some of these landlords haven't received rent for a particularly long time, Bruce. And, they've got some major issues on their hands there with that. And obviously, when we raised the point earlier on about, I'm down 80%, am I eligible for 80% relief? Well, yes, you are, but that is by 50% way of waiver and 50% deferral. We have had many cases whereby the landlord has made that deferral piece slightly smaller to get a bigger chunk of rent and to get it in a quicker time frame, again, to help their cash flow. So that's something that has really kind of been a part of that kind of negotiation as we've been going through the particular stages.
Yeah, I think obviously the other player in all of this is the banks, and depending on the relationship between the landlords and the banks, because the banks have deferred interest payments in lots of cases, and at some point they're going to want to start getting their money as well. So
Absolutely.
it's going to be tricky. Frank, there's a couple other questions in the chat. I might direct them at you to start with. So if a tenant doesn't have an ABN to claim rent relief, is claiming JobKeeper through another company? I think that's a similar question to what we've just answered. Depends on who the tenant. Yeah.
So the tenant doesn't have an ABN.
Doesn't have an ABN.
Okay. I haven't come across that. So, but they're entitled to. So it must be interesting because you're not running a business if you don't have an ABN.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you think about that one. You can answer that one in the chat. The other one is a question around income. We talked about online income. So if you're providing services from home, now this is an allied health business, does the turnover, it's not from the actual premises, it's actually from the home, does that get caught?
No.
Yes. Yep, sorry. Go, Lauren.
Sorry. Yeah, it's the rent relief must be proportionate to the decline in turnover associated with only the premises of which you're seeking rent relief for. So if you've shifted your business to another site and it happens to be that you can run it from home, then whatever turnover you're generating from home won't be caught as turnover for the purpose of calculating what your decline actually is.
Yep. And so and again, either Frank or Lauren, the month that when you're looking at the month, comparing months to months, which is it just as used in JobKeeper? So it's just a like for like 12 months, or is it a period?
So it can vary depending on how you got JobKeeper.
Yeah.
So if you got JobKeeper based on the September quarter versus last September quarter, then you compare like your calculation for your decline in turnover to calculate your rent will be based on October versus October last year. If you use the alternative methods, and there's up to 8 alternative methods, the actual base of sales that you for October's turnover compared to the comparable period varies depending on the alternative test that you use. So, as you know, there's multiple different version or types of alternative tests. So it will be, a calculation that your advisor would have to help you on, and then set that base.
Yeah. And I think one of the other questions around outgoings. And so Lauren, I think you mentioned that it's gross rent now. So it includes outgoings. Has that been clarified?
if your rent is a gross rent, then the way to calculate rent relief in terms of that proportionality, your rent will be reduced, and it's the gross rent. So there's no carve out of outgoings. If for outgoings that are payable separately, a landlord must consider waiving recovery of any outgoing that's paid by the tenant for any part of the period that the tenant's unable to actually operate their business at the premises. And if a tenant's not operating their business from the premises, the landlord can cease to provide or reduce services at the premises. So I suppose for tenants with retail leases, it's a matter of looking at your disclosure statement and the last estimate that the landlord gave you. Check what you're actually paying for. And, you know, if you're not using the premises, but you're paying for cleaning, then have the conversation with your landlord. Like, are they actually incurring those expenses? And if they're not, then, you know, negotiate a reduction in outgoings accordingly. Yeah.
So what about if you've done a deal for rent relief up until the 29th of September, but it didn't cover a later period? What happens now?
Yeah, so there's provisions in the old regs and in the amended ones that deal with subsequent rent relief. So if a tenant's financial circumstances have changed, or their previous rent relief agreement did not allow for rent relief that's proportionate to their decline in turnover, they can make another application for rent relief. And that's going through that process of providing a statement and giving all that those documents that Frank spoke about. And there's also been changes to the provisions that deal with what kind of rent relief a landlord needs to provide. So previously there was no obligation for a minimum waiver, whereas now they've changed that. So if a tenant goes back for subsequent rent relief, the landlord now must provide at least half of that as a waiver, or a 50% waiver. Yep.
Thanks. So Frank, if the JobKeeper scheme no longer applies, so up until the end of October, the tenant's receiving JobKeeper payments, but then they've fallen out of that net, what happens now for them in relation to their negotiations for their rent?
Yeah, so there's a few different outcomes here. So if you were on JobKeeper, now you're not, if you had an agreement with the landlord up until the 31st of December, then it doesn't matter if you aren't eligible for JobKeeper 2.0. You can still apply the proportionate rent calculation. Unfortunately, if you had an agreement up to the 29th of September and you aren't eligible for JobKeeper, then you can't apply these rules. And then thirdly, if you still are in dispute with the landlord and there hasn't been a resolution yet and you're not entitled to JobKeeper, there is a possibility that you can apply this up until the 31st of December. So there's a few different scenarios. That's why it's really important, to look at the alternative tests as well to see if you can get JobKeeper. What I'm also recommending to clients that don't fall under JobKeeper 2.0 and didn't have an agreement is that we still try to negotiate some form of rent discount or deferral based on the trading conditions, whether it's a percentage of turnover method based on just paying that upfront rent, and that's what it's purely calculated on. It might be like a 10% of turnover, and then capped out until you reach your monthly rent, or whether there's more that you can just defer as well. So that's where it's really important knowing what your October, November, December looks like. It's very hard, I guess, in Victoria because we just don't know when we're going to be let out again. But that's why that cash flow model has to kind of tie in with what you can afford. And then you go to the landlord going, well, this is, I've done my cash flow. I can afford 70% of rent. Can you discount some of it? Like, obviously you go for a discount first, or can we just, proportion that and defer it over the rest of the term of the lease? So, that's the options. And you'll just have to discuss with your advisor what method you go with.
Can I just clarify on that third point? So they're no longer, JobKeeper doesn't apply to them anymore, but they haven't reached an agreement on their rent prior to the end of September. So you said that continues, so they can still negotiate to their rent relief till the end of December because they haven't reached agreement.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay. Cal, how are you finding the landlords managing these negotiations to rent relief?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, like everything, I guess, related to COVID. But there's been some really positive responses and some negative ones too. Again, look, I think Keith will be able to talk more about shopping centre landlords, and Frank probably more about those private landlords. For me, with those those big sort of insto office landlords, when it comes to commercial leases, the first step that they typically do is look to blend and extend, which basically means, if you can extend your existing lease, so they push out their weighted average lease expiry of their office building. That's the motivation for your, for your office landlords. And that means that as a tenant, you can probably get a nice, rent-free period now when you need it the most. Whereas again, it then depends on the motivation of your landlord, which is really important to understand because, for example, a private landlord, like I think Keith mentioned before, might want cash now. So therefore, what's motivating them? What are those different levers in your negotiation that you can play with? And again, I couldn't agree more with Frank. It comes down to business modelling and doing your best to forecast so you can arm yourself with a spreadsheet and go and have those discussions on an informed basis. But look, I've spoken with I really like looking at Sydney, right? Because Melbourne and Sydney are comparable cities. You look at these other cities that we're reading about, we're stuck in lockdown in Melbourne, Perth and Brisbane, all that, having a good time and business as usual and stuff. So I think Sydney's really interesting given that they're not in lockdown yet. The cities are still very, very quiet. So I was chatting with a leading cafe operator up in the CBD, and they again were talking about how the office building that they're in is only 15 to 20% occupancy. And they said, look, if these office buildings can get back to sort of 50% occupancy or even up to 75% occupancy, like probably 50%, they can start to actually break even. But they were working really closely with their landlord because, again, the office landlord's motivation is how do we get people back into these CBD office buildings? So what is the motivation of that landlord? The motivation is keep the coffee shop open downstairs because we need amenity and services for these office workers when they do come in, so they keep coming back in and encourage more people to come back in. So those landlords are more likely just to waive rent than just to get a couple of staff in making coffees at the bottom of the building. So really understanding your landlord and their motivation is important. Again, there's those landlords who have been unwilling to even comply with the regulations, still trying to enforce existing lease conditions. And, there's that sense of feeling with some landlords, the regulations have actually sought to disturb their commercial arrangements that, they went through a year of negotiating to get to that position and I don't want to give an inch. And now that, the Small Business Commissioner has the power to make those binding orders on landlords to give, specified rent relief, some landlords are feeling hard done by that, the government's expecting them to carry a significant financial burden of COVID. So there's just mixed views. Unfortunately, it's, it just depends on your landlord, really. Talk to them, understand their motivation is my tip.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? And I think there were a number of stories early on for tenants where the landlords weren't responding, and so that was even harder because I think the example that you gave in an earlier webinar was that it's a little bit, they've got so many inquiries, and so they were dealing with so many, and so I guess at this point, and this is probably relevant, Keith, to the shopping centres as well, that they're trying to negotiate deals with every one of their tenants. How are you finding acting for a number of tenants in the shopping centres at the moment?
Yeah, look, it's hard work and it's quite exhausting on many of the team, but both teams, landlords and retailers. I think Callan pretty much, he talked about every single point there and covered it off beautifully. Look, I think initially they started off being a little bit more dogged, and certainly the landlords were a little bit more or less persuasive. I think as the process has gone through and they've seen that retailers have dug in, they've been a little bit more open-minded, and there's some lateral thinking and some blue sky thinking around how we can get a deal done. And again, depending on what kind of retailer you are, Bruce, and if you're a big portfolio, obviously you've got more weight. And depending on maybe potentially within that portfolio, what's in holdover gives you a lot of weight. So I think, look, it's been a mixed bag, but by and large, I have to say, most of the landlords have been good, and most of the landlords have tried to support. Now, you know, in many cases, you know, we get deals done. Not always probably what you would realistically like to get done, because I think, again, I keep going on about it, but the deferral piece is just a ticking time bomb. So not being able to, we talk about forecasting and spreadsheets, you know, it's probably one of the most difficult thing a retailer has to do generally. Forget about the climate, okay? Make a projection, make a forecast, go to the bank with that and see how they review it. Now, I mean, I retail for a long, long time, and it's not a science. It's a little bit of a, you know, you put your finger in the air, you use all the criteria and data as best you can in your history to be able to do it. To do that going forward in this environment is going to be nearly impossible. So in many respects, what we're asking retailers to do is to sign up to something that they don't know. They sit at an average op cost probably across a portfolio that is moving upwards and north at a serious rate. And when we've done some modeling around that, it's just not sustainable for some of these retailers to go into the new norm, not knowing what their sales forecast is going to look like, but yet already building in the deferral piece and looking at what that occupancy cost now has risen to. And we talk about, you know, businesses being sustainable and having growth. Well, they're all things that really you're in the dark about going into the new year, because it's just so unknown. So I think the landlord to a degree understands that, but they can be pretty dogged sometimes in their opinion. Probably lastly, what I'd say on it is there will be a new norm, because in days gone past, you had a situation whereby you had a landlord with a product, and basically if the retailer wasn't willing to pay what the landlord might have called a fair market rent, there was a retailer lined up behind him, and there was another one lined up behind him, and there's another one lined up behind her to take their place. Vacancy rates are going to be a big talking point going forward, and landlords are not going to have that in play. So hopefully that then gets back to a situation whereby realism kicks in, and potentially things like, you know, percentage rents are more of a conversation, and potentially de-risking deals whereby you're looking at a capped op cost, for example. All of those things are going to be explored in the new year. And I think, you know, some landlords are pretty much open to that now. Some don't want to shout about it because it obviously affects their shareholders, but it's certainly going to be a big talking point, and I think a big negotiation piece as we get over Christmas. One just last point, Bruce, which I think is important to say. I worked in a previous business that was the largest in Australia in its category and the fourth largest in the world. Had a portfolio of about 500 plus stores. And you would be surprised the amount of stores within that framework that didn't actually make money all year round and only made money in November and December, potentially January as well. Now, if you take that and, you know, whatever you do with it, and look at that moving forward as to what that could affect the mainstream going into January, having had the trauma of the last number of months, not knowing what the foot traffic is going to be like in the centres due to COVID, and, you know, does it go away? Do we have to live with it? How does that look like for a food operator in a food court with separation and 1.5 meters distance? All of those things have to be reviewed. And it's going to be just nearly impossible to actually get a definitive answer as to how that's all going to play out. So my worry is too that, you know, we're also going to have a percentage of retailers that have shown some real foresight in being able to pivot their business over the last number of months. But however, they're still, doesn't matter how good they are, they're going to still be very reliant on a very strong November, December trading period. And if that doesn't happen, that creates another set of issues. So we've got some work to do there. And I think, you know, the landlords have to be very aware of all that. And when you're negotiating, my advice to any retailer would be that they need to see that in advance and really articulate that with their landlord to see that this is the problems that we are going to face. And we need support to be able to face that together, so that you've got a sitting tenant paying rent and I've got a viable business with some possible sustainable growth.
And I think, as both you and Caleb indicated, it does really depend on where you are. So if you're in the Melbourne CBD, it's different between Melbourne suburbs and regional. And then obviously if you're interstate, it's a whole different story again. So, you know, if they're tenants with multiple sites, you know, then there's a lot of they're negotiating in different ways depending on the particular site. And what about, so Frank, you've had a few clients both on the landlord and the tenant side that have dealing with disputes over the rent during this period. And so what sort of tips have you had for the clients in trying to resolve these disputes?
I guess definitely getting the understanding of both financial sides. So, you know, because there are landlords out there that, there is this perception that landlords are wealthy, and it's not always the case when you've got like a retired couple that purely rely on their rent to, support their living. So in scenarios like that, we've, gone, well, let's do a deal where give us more cash up front. We won't do any deferral, and we'll give, half discount, half cash. And those that can kind of resolve certain situations. With Lauren and I have had a scenario where we had to go to VCAT and we couldn't negotiate an outcome, and we're lucky that it was a favourable outcome for us. So we've had one, I've had that scenario. I've had a whole mixed bag of scenarios. Majority have just applied the code of conduct, so that has helped significantly in the market. And with this quarter now being more legislated and enforced, it's going to make the negotiations, well, it's not going to be a negotiation, it's the law. It's just ensuring that if you haven't got JobKeeper, that's where we're going to have to go back to the drawing board. And, as Keith said, you've got to discuss, things that are practical on what the sales are going to be, and the pressure of deferrals on top of your existing rent. It's just got to be commercial, and you got to come to a result where both can survive, because the landlord might have bank debt they need to service. So it's really about it's all about communication. And it's a business relationship. One of the most important that you have in your business is the relationship with your landlord. And, they're the ones that, will extend your lease and make your business worth more. You can negotiate changes to your fit out and so forth. So it's really important just to have a good open relationship with them, and try to get the best outcome for both. If you go too aggressive on one side or the other, whether you're landlord or tenant, it just falls down, and then, you can end up in VCAT and, in mediation and so forth, and you just don't know what outcome you'll get then. So
when you and Lauren have gone into the negotiations, are you playing the good cop by the sounds of it? And Lauren, you're playing the bad cop. So how are you finding the negotiations?
Yeah, it's been an interesting 6 months, but I think the biggest lesson that comes out of it for both parties is transparency and communication are key. Look, where they've extended the regulations to some extent, and I think Cal or Keith alluded to this before, it's kind of in one way prolonging the pain, because who knows what's going to happen from the 1st of January. So we've now got less than 3 months for tenants and landlords to reach rent relief deals. And there's no uncertainty as to what will happen if they don't from the 1st of January. So I'm seeing tenants that are dealing with really non-responsive landlords, and I think that's entirely strategic, where they're just sort of in effect going to ground and perhaps waiting until the 11th hour, and then presenting a deal to their tenants and trying to force their hand. The regulations have dealt with that, so landlords now have an obligation to respond within 14 days. So that should alleviate that problem somewhat. And then the other side of it is you've got tenants that are just refusing to pay rent. And as Frank mentioned, you've got to have regard for the relationship, and it is a business relationship, and depending on how long you've been at the premises, how long you plan to stay at the premises, it's a relationship that you need to take into consideration, and tenants that aren't paying rent aren't doing themselves any favours. In terms of mediation, it's most mediators are sort of applying sort of the black letter of the law. I mean, they're obviously impartial, but they are very much having regard for initially the code and now what's prescribed, being that proportionate rent relief. So if a landlord is going into mediation expecting that they don't need to provide that minimum rent relief entitlement, then I think they're going to be pretty disappointed. So yeah, communication, transparency, and just do what you can to reach a deal.
There's been a couple of questions in relation to people getting out of leases as well. And so, a lease that's going to expire early in the new year, turnover's down significantly. You've got the deferment option, but it's not a great, and you found that maybe you don't need the space. Have you had experience with people trying to get break leases now, or now insert new, exit clauses into leases?
Yeah, the break clause, the break lease one's interesting. I think if you're in a situation where you don't need the premises and your lease ends next year, you're in a pretty fortunate position that most others would be envious of. In terms of break clauses, when Christchurch had those earthquakes a number of years ago, as a result of that, most of their leases now have provisions in them that allow tenants and or landlords to bring the lease to an end in circumstances where the premises can no longer be used. So I've seen some adaptations of that to deal with sort of a pandemic scenario. For some of my clients, we're trying to write that into leases for the new transactions that we're working on. I don't think it's sort of a widely accepted thing yet, so it's a bit of a hard sell. But again, depends on your relationship with the landlord. If you see longevity in the premises you're trading from, and just having that conversation with your landlord.
Yeah, so the question links back to also turnover at a certain level, that that if lockdown occurs and turnover drops again, that you can get out of your lease. Have you seen anything like that?
No, but I suppose if you're wanting to put a break clause in, like, a landlord's not going to agree to it, so you need to offer something that they might consider. So again, that might be if your turnover drops to X, then you change the way the rent is calculated, where it might be a base rent plus percentage rent. I know that Cal's had some experience, probably more so with landlords striking deals on percentage rents.
Yeah, look, that's probably leading into the where to from here, and it's certainly, I guess, the problem with the property industry, you get these long-term leases that are completely inflexible, right? And the laws around that, so you either pay your rent or you get thrown out, and that's pretty much it, as Keith was saying before. And then there's another tenant to fill that space. Well, now there may not be due to lack of demand. So, but that being said, even before COVID, a lot of landlords had grown really tired of that traditional approach, particularly to retail leasing. But basically locked into that system due to the laws, but also the way the property financing and valuation works as well, where they're motivated to get these long-term leases with secure income, even if it's completely unachievable. It serves its purpose from a property perspective. And I experienced this firsthand in my placemaking business at Blue Rock Places, because we're actually working really closely with Blue Rock accounting team, like Frank and his colleagues in the accounting division, to prepare retail business models, not for the retail tenants, but actually for the landlords and the developers, to actually help them understand, the business model, to think about, forecast sales, expenses, profit, and not just the rent, which is, being a person who's worked in, property as a landlord and developer for near on 20 years, it's ingrained into you just to focus on the rent. And by actually understanding that business model and testing the best that you can, actually helps advise and get the landlord and developers head around a sustainable rent, notwithstanding they still need to achieve those feasibility parameters. So look, that trend was already happening. And like, with a lot of things, COVID's accelerated that. I think that the positive out of COVID is that transparency, talking about turnover with your retailer rather than just signing a lease and not talking unless you're not paying your rent, is, in my view, a real positive. Whether it's for good or worse, that transparency is here. And while, to Keith's point, trying to forecast things right now is bloody near impossible, to actually go and meet with, people like Frank or your accountant to actually forecast different scenarios, good case, bad case, moderate case, and then at least have a basis to say, okay, well, if this happens, this is the resultant low base rent with a turnover provision, so you can share with your landlord. Likewise, if you're a landlord sitting there, to preempt that, to try to engage with your tenant, to have those discussions, to at least agree a framework. If this happens, this is how we're going to get through it together. And I think that's the only method that I've been working on that has really had engagement from both parties, to still put some science and parameters around the what if scenarios leading into next year.
Speaking of science, so data is obviously very important. So, you're involved in our technology business. So how's the use of data been helpful in these discussions?
Yeah, so look, Propeller AI is a property technology company that's basically been incubated by BlueRock, and which I'm a part of as well. And we're using things like people movement data through mobile devices, which is all de-identified information, to actually see how people are, I guess, behaving. So what we're actually working on right now is modelling different scenarios with the return to work scenarios in terms of working from home. We looked at, there's actually a fairly significant portion of the workforce that was already working from home part-time. And then, so we're just looking at different scenarios under different, like banking or finance or, whatever industries, applying different percentages of how many people will return on, how many hours per week back to these CBD places. And then if they don't, well, what's the impact on the fringe suburbs around Melbourne and Sydney in terms of the increased density of those office workers that are now sitting at home? So therefore, where should we be opening a new cafe or a new whatever in terms of the services being provided? So yeah, the next couple of weeks we'll come out with some information about trying to help our clients, both landlords and tenants, think about, I guess, the opportunities as a result of this. In some of those suburbs that we're forecasting certainly an increased population from Monday to Friday.
Thanks, Cal. So Keith, we've a couple of minutes left, but just to quickly, what are you saying to your tenants in how they manage their leases when business goes back to normal, whatever that means, post-COVID?
Yeah, another good question. I suppose I like to use a word called de-risk, and obviously when you've got an uncertain environment and you don't know what you're getting into, a 5 and 7 year lease doesn't look very attractive. So I think once it can be de-risked, whether it be a shorter term with options, whether it's a cap rent, percentage rent, certainly no personal guarantees, and then getting a good understanding. Sometimes retailers don't ask enough questions of the landlord in terms of what their plans are around marketing or maybe additional, builds that was going to happen or extensions within the centre. So it's getting a really good insight into what you're getting into partnership with, and the landlord is a part of that business. So I think, de-risk is probably the key word, Bruce, because, look, I think that what we haven't mentioned today is there's certain categories still within the landscape are actually trading quite well. And there's certainly some businesses out there are growing, and we've got certainly plenty of them on our books, and that's really encouraging. But to a degree, you still need to be able to try and de-risk a deal, so everybody, can I suppose, be profitable out of it. So that's what we try and do. Lauren mentioned something earlier on about leases. We deal with a very big international client that already have kind of, given us some clauses that maybe will need to be inputted into leases going forward from the States. And I think you will find that will be a new norm. I think if potentially these pandemics are something that we're going to have to live with as a society going forward, you're going to have to be covered. And I think landlords will eventually have to come to the party on that. And, it's not necessarily fair from a government perspective to say to a retailer, you've got to close your doors. And, we can't let people trade outside of a 5K radius or travel within a 5K radius. And by the way, you still got to pay 50% of your outgoings and a deferred rent. That just doesn't make sense in a business world. Why would you get into that in the first instance if that was going to be the case? So I think all of those things need to be reviewed, and your lease needs to be pretty much locked tight in that regard. And you need to make sure you get some really good advice to do that.
Thank you very much. Well, right on time finishing up. There's a few questions that we've got that we didn't get time to answer. So Lauren and Frank can go back and answer those questions afterwards. So thank you very much for everyone that's engaged in the process, ask some questions, and for your feedback. Thank you to the panel, to Cal, to Keith, to Frank, and to Lauren for your insights into a really tricky situation that's ongoing. And one of the toughest things as part of COVID to negotiate is, with all these different parties and with landlords, banks and tenants all trying to get a fair outcome and to allow their businesses to keep trading. So it's definitely not easy, and you've explained the challenges and also given some great tips. So thank you very much. And good luck for everyone as the world opens up back again, and good luck with running your business. Thanks for joining. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.